You take a breath with me again. Thank you. How many people remember the movie The Little Mermaid? Anybody? Yeah. In case you haven't seen it, the main character, the mermaid Ariel, wants to be a human. And she wants it so badly that she makes a deal with Ursula the Sea Witch to trade her voice for human legs. Without her voice, Ariel struggles to communicate on land, and there are misunderstandings, and the life she wants so desperately seems out of reach. She fits in the human world, but without her voice, she's unable to find her place. Now, no one here, I don't think, is secretly a mermaid in human form, but I do wonder if you've ever traded your voice for something. Have you ever traded it for a chance to fit in? Have you ever given away your chance to speak your truth in exchange for a day without conflict? Have you ever failed to speak up for yourself or others because you were afraid of what people might think of you? I contend that those reasons are common, and I suspect that each of us has at some point given up our voice, given up our chance to speak, because we were worried about what would happen. Now here's the caveat. Living in these United States is a lot these days. The new administration is doing many things they said they would, and they're doing it all at once. And we need to remember that the overwhelm and the chaos are part of the tactic. It's a tactic to wear down resistance. And I'm reminded of this small piece of wisdom that says, the times are urgent. We must slow down. If you've been paying attention to the news this week, I assume that you're exhausted. And even if you have taken care to limit your exposure to the news, you've probably heard enough to make you at least a little tired. And like I said last week, many of us are still dealing with changes wrought in our lives and our society by the pandemic. And so, if you are exhausted right now, hear me say that I want you to take care of your mental, physical, and spiritual health. Do that first. Tuck this sermon away for when you are renewed and ready, because this fight for justice has been and will be long, and we need you to be well enough to do the parts that are yours to do. Got it? Those of us who are ready to engage, we will need to pace ourselves. An analogy that I like to help me think about this is about singing in a choir. If you've ever seen choral music, you know that sometimes there's a note that goes from measure to measure, from page to page even sometimes. And the expectation is that that sound will continue for a long period of time, but no one singer can do that at once themselves. And so what happens in a choir is that the singers take turns holding the note, drop out for a breath, and come back. We need to do the same in our resistance. One of the most accessible ways to participate in the resistance right now that is not a huge outlay of energy, but it does take courage, is to use your voice, to try to influence what's happening and speak up for what is right, even when your voice shakes. To inspire you and perhaps give you a little oomph to get that courage gathered up, I wanted to share some stories from our Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist heritage of people who were courageous enough to speak their truth and to speak prophetically, that is to say, to speak truth to power. I wanted to tell you as a way to encourage you, to put courage in you. These people aren't household names, and they weren't super powerful or influential. They were just regular people who gathered their courage and spoke their truth in the service of justice. And the first person I want to tell you about is named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Does anyone know who she is? No. You claim her as one of our Unitarian ancestors, And the American Methodist Episcopal Church also claims her because she attended both kinds of congregations. In 1845, when she was 20, she became the first Black woman to be published in the United States when she published a book of poetry. 1845. During her life, she was a teacher, a writer, a public speaker, and an activist for suffrage, temperance, and the abolition of slavery. As a suffragist, she attended the 1866 National Women's Rights Convention in New York City. Harper was invited to speak at this convention. Her speech demanded equal rights for all and emphasized the need to advocate for African American suffrage as well as suffrage for women. And she said, in part, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity." Is that familiar to anyone else? Martin Luther King? Yeah. "And society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You white women here speak of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man, and every man's hand against me. While there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and their selfishness, it is the white women of America." Can you imagine the courage? She said to these women assembled there, it's 1866, just after the end of the Civil War. And it's interesting to me that she articulated the intersectionality that, I forgot her name. What's her name? Kimberly Crenshaw? Yeah, Kimberly Crenshaw articulated that being both Black and a woman was different from being a Black person, a Black man, or a white woman. Our second example of courage comes from more recent times. The scene is our 1993 General Assembly. General Assembly is the Continental Meeting for Unitarian Universalists, and it was held that year in Charlotte, North Carolina. Our association used to be divided into districts, we're now regions, but at the time we had districts, and that district that Charlotte was part of was called the Thomas Jefferson District. 1993 was Jefferson's 250th birthday, and the General Assembly Planning Committee decided that the Saturday night social event would celebrate him. They suggested that the people who wanted to attend the Saturday night gathering, the Thomas Jefferson Ball, dress in period costumes from the early 19th century. You can see where this is going, yes? We've learned a lot, maybe since 1993. At the first business session, Hope Johnson, a Black woman and a lay leader in her congregation, stepped to the microphone and read a statement. It was from a group called the African American Unitarian Universalist Ministers, and their allies had joined them, allies from a variety of racial and cultural backgrounds. The statement argued that Jefferson, a quote, unrepentant slaveholder who advocated the extermination of indigenous peoples in America, honoring him showed a profound lack of sensitivity and judgment, particularly in view of the UUA's stated thrust this year toward racial and ethnic diversity. If UUs were to wear period costumes, Johnson asked, must African Americans attend such events in rags and chains? Reflecting on that experience 25 years later, at a workshop at the 2018 General Assembly, Johnson, who later became a UU minister, said that after she spoke, you could have heard a pin drop in the hall. After she read that statement, the moderator asked that a group be formed quickly to make a suggestion for how the assembly should move forward. 1 hour later, Johnson and 12 others returned and suggested that the UUs there should decide for themselves whether they wanted to attend the dance and whether they wanted to wear period costume. Some folks did attend the dance, and some organized a protest. And the event and that conflict helped galvanize our association's work toward becoming anti-racist. Our third example is even more recent, and it's from May of 2019. At that time, there had been a push for several years to expand Medicaid in Kansas, where I lived. The expansion would have extended Medicaid coverage to a larger group of people, including those who fell in the gap, who made too much to qualify for basic Medicaid, but did not make enough to actually afford a premium. Failing to expand Medicaid had had big repercussions in the state. Rural hospitals were struggling, and some had closed, creating a situation where a person might have to drive many, many miles to receive life-saving care. The thousands of people who were uninsured often didn't get preventative care, meaning that they would show up at emergency rooms with serious issues that could have been prevented. But the Kansas legislature was and still is led by and dominated by people who are focused on cutting taxes and reducing the government's reach. And so this has been a years-long battle. Throughout 2017, 2018, 2019, I was a new seminarian, and I spent a lot of time at the Capitol in Topeka with my friends, my UU friends, in my yellow Side with Love t-shirt. We participated in creative, nonviolent actions. We listened to testimony. We attended rallies. On the last day of the legislative session in 2019, the legislators had still not brought Medicaid expansion to a vote. They had parked it in a committee, hoping that people would just forget it. We were in the balcony above the Senate floor as they were wrapping up their business that day. My colleague, the Reverend Sarah Oglesby Dunnigan, who's a white woman and one of the organizers for this ongoing pressure, was seated next to the railing. She stood up, all 5 feet of her, in her collar and her stole, and began speaking in a loud voice, asking, "Are you going to vote on Medicaid expansion?" The gavel went down, bang, 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 but she continued. She said, "You have had all year to discuss this and to pass it. People are suffering because of your inaction," she said. "Shame on you. Finish the work." She continued to speak, and a large man who may be an usher or security, it wasn't clear, he came and put his hand on her shoulder and said she needed to leave. She looked up at him, and it was up for her, and calmly said, "Are you going to arrest me? Because I'm not leaving until they either pass Medicaid expansion or I'm arrested. Those are the choices." Then she turned from him and threw her arms in the air and said, "Lord, hear our prayer. We want health care." And she began to sing, "There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more love somewhere." The man kept pulling on her, talking to her, getting her to leave, and finally she was removed from the gallery and added another check mark on her arrest record for civil disobedience. I'm guessing that these 3 women, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Hope Johnson, and Sarah Oglesby Dunnigan, had done that calculus that Audre Lorde describes. They had weighed the risks and they had chosen to speak. For these 3 courageous women, the problems they spoke about did not change immediately. For Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the right to vote for Black people wasn't guaranteed until almost 100 years later, and it's still being challenged. Hope Johnson's courageous question in the UU General Assembly fell on more receptive ears. She was with UUs, and much change has come from it, but we are still not free of white supremacy in our own movement. And Reverend Sarah's courageous actions have still not forced the Kansas legislature to pass Medicaid expansion. But her example bolstered the courage of many people that day, and I would guess also the nearly 5,000 people who have watched the video of her encounter on Facebook. We can follow the example of these women today, especially those of us who hold some privilege. Those of us with some privilege must learn to be more courageous and speak up so that the people most affected by these harmful policies don't have to do all the labor. And where does this courage come from? I say courage comes from the power of our convictions. When we know deep in our bones that all people deserve to be treated fairly and humanely. Courage comes from our understanding that we are all connected in the interdependent web of existence, that what affects you affects me, that we all do better when we all do better. Courage can also come from getting some training in using your voice. Organizations working for justice, both within our faith and outside, offer trainings on how best to engage. I think sometimes those of us who've seen clips or just read about the civil rights movement forget that those people did not just show up at a lunch counter on that day. In most instances, people had been training, meeting weekly for months. They were disciplined. They knew they had a plan. They were trained and they knew what to do and how to do it. And so training is going to be important for us. For some of us, showing up for a protest or a march might not be our style. But perhaps you would rather call or write your representatives in Congress, either to thank them for doing the right thing or to do what my mom used to call, send what my mom used to call a do better letter, encouraging them to vote against or speak out about unjust legislation or cabinet appointments. Or if that's not your style, maybe you're the one who prints the flyers for the training and hangs them up or shows up at the meetings at the school board and the local government. Or perhaps you're an artist and you will create art that challenges the powerful. Or you'll get involved here at church as we figure out the church's role in all this. There are many, many possibilities, and there's a place for you there. Our courage grows when we know that not speaking out is worse than our fear of speaking out. We'll get through this. How are we going to get through this? Together. We will get through this together. Let's go. Love is calling. Amen.